The situation between Washington and Tehran has reached what can only be described as a critical juncture, one that demands our careful attention, because what unfolds in the coming weeks will unfolds in the coming weeks, will unfolds in the coming weeks, will fundamentally reshape not just the Middle East, but the entire architecture of global power. Now, what we're witnessing isn't simply another round of diplomatic posturing or the usual cycle of threats and counter-threats that have characterized US-Iran relations for decades. No, this is something far more significant. The Trump administration is simultaneously pursuing two seemingly contradictory tracks. On one hand, ramping up military pressure with naval deployments, enhanced sanctions enforcement, and very public demonstrations of force in the Persian Gulf, while on the other hand, keeping diplomatic channels conspicuously open through quiet back-channel communications. This dual approach, this carrot and stick strategy, if you will, tells us something profound about the calculations being made in Washington. The question isn't whether escalation is happening, it's already happening. The real question, the one that should concern every American watching global events unfold, is whether this pressure campaign is designed to force Iran into genuine negotiations and concessions, or whether we're witnessing the carefully choreographed prelude to something far more dangerous, military confrontation that could ignite the entire region. Now, to properly understand what's happening right now between the United States and Iran, we need to take a step back and look at the broader historical context, because nothing in international relations happens in a vacuum, and this current escalation is no exception. We're dealing with a relationship that has been fundamentally broken since 1979, since the Iranian Revolution and the hostage crisis that followed. But what makes this particular moment so fascinating and frankly so dangerous is that we're seeing the return of Donald Trump to the presidency with what appears to be a very specific agenda regarding Iran, an agenda that differs significantly from the approach taken during the Biden years, and indeed differs even from Trump's own first term in some crucial respects. During Trump's first presidency, we saw the withdrawal from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal that had been negotiated under Obama. That withdrawal in 2018 was followed by what the administration called a maximum pressure campaign, which involved reimposing sanctions, adding new sanctions, and essentially attempting to economically strangle Iran into submission. The theory, as articulated by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo at the time, was that this pressure would force Iran back to the negotiating table where a better deal could be struck, a deal that wouldn't just address nuclear issues, but would also constrain Iran's missile program and its regional activities through proxy forces in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. Now, that didn't quite work out as planned. Iran didn't collapse economically, although it certainly suffered. Instead, Iran adapted, found ways around sanctions through partnerships with China and Russia, developed a resistance economy, as they called it, and actually became more assertive regionally rather than less so. What we're seeing now, as Trump begins his second term, is what appears to be a recalibration of that strategy. The military pressure component has been dramatically increased. We've seen the deployment of additional carrier strike groups to the region. We've seen B-52 strategic bombers positioned at bases within striking distance of Iranian territory. We've seen increased intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance flights along Iran's borders. These aren't just symbolic gestures. These are very real military capabilities being positioned in a way that gives Washington genuine operational options should the decision be made to use them. At the same time, and this is where it gets particularly interesting, there are credible reports from multiple sources suggesting that diplomatic channels remain open, that intermediaries are facilitating communication between Washington and Tehran, and that both sides, despite the public rhetoric, may actually be exploring whether there's a pathway to some kind of understanding. Now, why would this be happening? Why would you see this apparent contradiction between military escalation and diplomatic outreach? Well, this is actually a classic negotiating strategy, one that has been used throughout history by various powers. The idea is that you negotiate from a position of strength, that you demonstrate your capability and willingness to use force in order to make your diplomatic offers more credible and more attractive to the other side. The message being sent to Tehran is essentially this: we can make your situation much worse through military action, but we're also offering you a way out through negotiations, so you'd better take the diplomatic option seriously. This is sometimes called coercive diplomacy, and it can work, but it's also extremely dangerous because it requires both sides to very carefully calibrate their actions and their responses, and miscalculation in such situations can lead to unintended escalation. From the Iranian perspective, and we need to understand their viewpoint to make sense of what might happen next, this looks like more of the same pressure that they've already endured and survived for years. The Iranian leadership, particularly the Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei and the Revolutionary Guard commanders, have repeatedly stated that they will not negotiate under pressure, that they view such pressure as a form of humiliation that they cannot accept. There's also a deep-seated mistrust of American promises and commitments, rooted not just in the Trump administration's withdrawal from the nuclear deal, but going back decades to various historical grievances. The Iranians remember the 1953 coup against Mossadegh. They remember American support for Saddam Hussein during the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s. They remember being labeled part of an axis of evil after cooperating with the United States in Afghanistan following 9/11s. So there's a very strong strain of thought in Tehran that says you cannot trust American offers, that any deal will eventually be abandoned when politically convenient for Washington. At the same time, Iran is not in a strong position economically or domestically. The sanctions have taken their toll. The Iranian currency has depreciated significantly. There are periodic protests over economic conditions. The government faces genuine challenges in maintaining public support. So there are pragmatic voices within the Iranian system, particularly among technocrats and some elements of the elected government, as opposed to the unelected religious establishment, who argue that Iran cannot afford indefinite confrontation, that some kind of accommodation with the West is necessary for Iran's economic survival and development. This internal debate within Iran between those who prioritize ideological resistance and those who prioritize pragmatic economic concerns is absolutely crucial to understanding what options Tehran might consider. Now, let's talk about what Trump himself wants from this situation, because that's not entirely clear, and there may actually be some internal debate within his own administration about objectives. One possibility is that Trump genuinely wants a deal, wants to be able to claim that he succeeded where others failed, that he got a comprehensive agreement with Iran that addresses all American concerns. Trump has often spoken about his deal-making abilities, and there's certainly an appeal to him in being the president who finally solved the Iran problem. The question would be what such a deal would look like, what Iran would have to give up, and what Iran would get in return. Would it involve sanctions relief? Would it involve recognition of Iran's regional role? Would it involve security guarantees? These are all questions that would need to be answered in any serious negotiation. Another possibility, and one that concerns many analysts and certainly concerns Iran itself, is that the real objective is regime change, that the pressure campaign is designed not to force negotiations, but to create conditions inside Iran that lead to the overthrow of the Islamic Republic. There are certainly voices in Washington, particularly among neoconservative circles and among some advisors who have Trump's ear, who have long advocated for regime change in Iran. They argue that the Islamic Republic is fundamentally unreformable, that it will always be a source of instability and anti-American activity in the region, and that the only real solution is a change of government in Tehran. The problem with this objective, if it is indeed the objective, is that it's much easier to articulate than to achieve. Regime change from the outside is extraordinarily difficult, as the experiences in Iraq, Libya, and Afghanistan have demonstrated. And there's no guarantee that whatever follows the Islamic Republic would actually be better from an American perspective or more stable. There's also a third possibility, which is that there isn't really a clear, coherent strategy at all, that we're seeing reactive policy making driven by events and by competing factions within the administration, rather than a carefully planned approach. This might sound cynical, but it's actually not uncommon in foreign policy. Administrations often claim to have strategies when in reality they're responding to pressures from various directions: domestic political pressures, pressures from allies like Israel and Saudi Arabia, who have their own Iran policies and agendas, pressures from military and intelligence services, who are presenting options and warnings, and pressures from economic interests who want access to Iranian markets or who are affected by disruptions in the Persian Gulf region. Now, we also need to consider the role of regional actors in all of this, because US-Iran tensions don't exist in isolation. Israel has its own very strong views about Iran, viewing the Islamic Republic as an existential threat, particularly because of Iran's nuclear program and its support for groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Gaza. The Israeli government has been conducting what amounts to a shadow war against Iran for years, including sabotage operations, assassinations of nuclear scientists, and airstrikes against Iranian positions in Syria. Israel would very much like to see the United States take a harder line against Iran, potentially including military action, and Israel has significant influence in Washington through various channels. At the same time, there are serious questions about whether Israeli interests and American interests are actually aligned on this issue, or whether the United States might find itself being drawn into a conflict that primarily serves Israeli objectives rather than American ones. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates also have major stakes in how this plays out. They've been engaged in regional rivalry with Iran for years, competing for influence across the Middle East. However, interestingly, both Saudi Arabia and the UAE have in recent years moved towards some degree of accommodation with Iran, restoring diplomatic relations and seeking to reduce tensions. This reflects their own calculations that indefinite confrontation with Iran isn't serving their interests, that it's creating instability that affects their economies and development plans. So while they want the United States to constrain Iran, they may not actually want a war, which could have catastrophic effects on the region, including on their own territories and economies. This creates a complex situation where America's traditional allies in the Gulf may be sending mixed messages about what they actually want Washington to do. Then there's the global dimension that we absolutely cannot ignore. Russia and China both have significant relationships with Iran, and both have strong interests in preventing American dominance in the Middle East. Russia and Iran have been cooperating closely in Syria, and Russia has been supplying Iran with advanced weapon systems. China is Iran's largest oil customer and has signed what it calls a comprehensive strategic partnership with Iran, worth potentially hundreds of billions of dollars over 25 years. Both Russia and China would likely oppose any American military action against Iran, not necessarily through direct military intervention, but through diplomatic opposition, through providing Iran with intelligence and potentially defensive weapon systems, and through helping Iran evade sanctions. This means that American action against Iran could have ripple effects far beyond the Middle East, potentially accelerating the formation of what some analysts call a new bloc of countries opposed to American global leadership. So, given all of these factors, what comes next? What are the possible scenarios we should be watching for? The most optimistic scenario would be that the current pressure campaign actually succeeds in bringing Iran to serious negotiations, that both sides find a formula that allows them to claim victory to their domestic audiences, while actually reaching substantive agreements on nuclear issues, regional security, and economic normalization. This isn't impossible. There have been moments in history when long-standing adversaries found ways to reach accommodation. Nixon going to China is the classic example, but it requires leadership on both sides that's willing to take political risks, that's willing to weather criticism from hardliners, and that's willing to make genuine compromises. It's not clear that either Trump or Iran's supreme leader has the political space or the inclination to do this right now. A more concerning scenario is limited military confrontation. This could take various forms. It might involve American strikes against Iranian nuclear facilities, similar to what Israel did to Iraq's reactor in 1981 or Syria's reactor in 2007. It might involve naval confrontations in the Persian Gulf if there are incidents involving Iranian forces and American vessels or merchant shipping. It might involve proxy conflicts escalating in places like Iraq or Syria or Yemen, where Iranian-backed forces and American forces or American-backed forces could come into direct or indirect conflict. The danger with limited military confrontation is that it tends not to stay limited. Each side feels pressure to respond to the other's actions, and what starts as a contained incident can spiral into something much larger. This is often called the escalation ladder, and once you're on it, it's very hard to get off. The worst case scenario, obviously, would be full-scale war between the United States and Iran. This would be a catastrophe for the region and would have global implications. Iran has significant retaliatory capabilities. It can't defeat the United States militarily in a conventional sense, but it can impose very serious costs. It can attack American bases in the region. It can strike at American allies, including Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE with missiles and drones. It can use proxy forces across the Middle East to target American interests. It can disrupt shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, through which about 21% of global petroleum passes. Such a war would likely lead to massive spikes in oil prices, would devastate Iran, would cause significant American casualties, and would create enormous instability across the entire Middle East with unpredictable consequences. It's worth noting that American military leaders have generally been very cautious about the idea of war with Iran, precisely because they understand these risks. There's also a scenario of continued stalemate where neither breakthrough nor breakdown occurs, where we simply continue with this pattern of pressure and resistance, of periodic crises that don't quite tip over into war, but also don't lead to resolution. This might actually be the most likely outcome in the near term. Neither side may be ready for either war or genuine compromise, so we may see this tense, unstable situation persist for months or even years. The problem with prolonged stalemate is that it increases the likelihood of miscalculation over time. The more often you have close calls and near misses, the greater the probability that eventually one of them turns into an actual conflict. What should Americans watching all of this understand? First, that the stakes are enormous. This isn't some distant conflict that doesn't affect ordinary Americans. A war with Iran would affect gas prices, would affect the economy, would likely involve American military personnel being put in harm's way, and could reshape global politics for decades. Second, that there are no easy solutions. Both the option of military action and the option of diplomatic engagement come with serious risks and serious costs. Anyone claiming to have a simple answer to the Iran problem is either naive or dishonest. Third, that what happens next will depend not just on decisions made in Washington, but on decisions made in Tehran, in Tel Aviv, in Riyadh, in Moscow, in Beijing, and in other capitals. This is a genuinely multilateral situation where no single actor has complete control. And finally, that the American public has a right and indeed a responsibility to be informed and engaged on this issue, to ask questions of their elected representatives, to demand clear explanations of what the administration's objectives actually are and what the plan is for achieving them. The decision to go to war is supposed to rest with Congress, not with the executive branch alone, and yet we've seen over recent decades a pattern of military commitments being made without proper congressional authorization or public debate. That needs to change, and this situation with Iran is exactly the kind of issue where democratic accountability really matters.